appreciate everybody being here this afternoon. As I said, we got a great session. This continues our series. Welcoming you to introduce yourself on the chat. Kenny Taylor will be monitoring there as well. So this is, my name is Will Brown. I'm at the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy, and pleased to be able to have with us a session here on decision making and scenario planning. As I say, this is a tricky context to begin thinking about how you make decisions, but all of us have to do it. We're moving forward, and we're hoping that things can begin to pick up just a little bit. So we've got Jose Quintana and a team that he has from AdventGX, and I'll go on ahead and introduce them here in just a second. I do want to sort of give the little bit of background about the center. Many of you have seen this slide already, but the center was formed in 2017, and we do a variety of things in thinking about a vibrant nonprofit and philanthropic sector in Texas and beyond. And so part of these webinars are part of what we're doing. As you can see, we have a whole portfolio of educational opportunities available, and continually, and especially in times like this, our values have continued to rise up and help us as an anchor to not only we think about our mission and our purpose, but we think about what are the values that are important to us. And so we continue to come back to the core kind of framework that's important to us around nonprofit organizations, ensuring that people have opportunities to be able to engage in their communities, and that the role of leaders in governance is key and instrumental in being able to make that happen. So as I say, we got a great session, and I want to get right to it. So let me just do a little bit of an intro to folks and be able to give you a sense of who we have here today. So Jose Quintana is president of AdventGX. Mr. Quintana has a wealth of startup experience. As a lifelong entrepreneur, he started several successful companies, has acted as consultant to many of the world's top corporations, including Nokia, Sprint, Qualcomm, Frito-Lay, Disney, Lockheed, Sun Microsystems, Verizon, Novartis International. He's an active board member of the Global Knowledge Group, Power Kids, the Texas Lyceum Association, West Clark Consulting Group, and the Research Valley Technology Alliance. Mr. Quintana is also proud to serve as the advisory council member at the Texas Engineering Extension Service. And so we're honored to be able to have Jose here with us. And then Aabid Razvi is a student response lead of the student response team, is the lead for College Station native. So Aabid has worked with AdventGX since 2015, and he's currently pursuing a business honors and finance double major with a minor in Arabic and cybersecurity. Primarily, he oversees the operations of the student resource team, serves as a liaison between the advisory council and the response team, and at Texas A&M, he is part of the Business Student Council and the Big Event, and among other things. This past year, he's also begun consulting with school districts around the state and coaching their speak and debate teams. In his spare time, he enjoys traveling, basketball, and spending time with friends and family. Travis Cantwell, in his role as head of management and operations for the team, while he now calls Austin his home, he grew up in a small town north of Dallas. Travis is a business honors and finance double major with a minor in economics. He has a passion for public policy and hopes one day to work at the intersection of finance and public policy on his team. He will be creating the standard operating procedures, overseeing scheduling, and creating weekly reports. On campus, he's held leadership positions in the Freshman Leadership Organization, Fish Aids, and the Leadership Initiative Conference. Additionally, he attended the Gilbert Leadership Conference, and he is a business he works with the Business Honors Office as well. In his spare time, he enjoys reading books, runs, and good conversations. So this would be appropriate for this afternoon. And Mia Barone, undertaking a role as the research coordinator for the team. Mia is a business honors student from Austin, majoring in marketing with a focus on analytics and minoring in arts and new media. She's tasked with updating news feeds and archives, listening to the feedback from the AdventGX Council, and providing current updates to the team. On campus, Mia is part of the business works in the honors office and has a multitude of administrative tasks. Chiefly serving as the social media coordinator. In her free time, she enjoys reading and hiking and spending time with friends and family. So with that, as you can tell, we've got a great team. Going to get some new perspectives here today. Thrilled to be able to have them as a part of what's going on. And Jose, I think I'll turn it over to you. And I know Mia is going to share her slides as well. So honored again, Jose, to have your team and you with us today, but it's all yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Brown. It's great. Thank you for having us today. Just wanted to give you a little bit of context before our team starts the presentation. Um, just wanted you to know that we are based out of Bryan College Station, as Dr. Brown mentioned, and our mission is to be able to help underserved communities and rural communities within the community development context. And when we went through the COVID kind of emergency, the situation really prompted a lot of our small businesses that we help to approach us for support. So we developed a COVID response resource center, and that's what kind of created the initiative. I then, I think I was working late, maybe 1, 2 in the morning, when I got an email from Aabid, very touching email saying, "Hey, Jose, I know how much the businesses in our community are hurting. I just wanted you to know that I would love to help. So if there's anything I can do to support that, please let me know." So I immediately replied to him and said, "Well, as a matter of fact, we're putting together a resource pool and a number of tools. It would be great if you can help me recruit students to be able to provide support one-on-one." And I think by 3 or 4 in the morning, we had agreed on how that would work. And then soon thereafter, Aabid put a team together for us, and the members of the team are amazing. All of them are honor students. And obviously, I'm very proud that you're going to meet 3 of them today. But I just wanted to give you some history about it from when we started supporting businesses. We have been able to help on and off companies one-on-one. I know I personally supported a handful of them, and then the teams supported another. I think the full balance is around 12 entities that we have helped on a one-on-one consultancy basis. But also on the online, with the resources that we put in place, we have had over 550 individual users or visitors that have downloaded resources from our website. And these are very practical tools that we put together, everything from how to deal with the emergency from a financial perspective, but also kind of some examples on how to deal with vendors or with landlords, and how to do that in a proper way. So I was going to mention that not only Texas has had a lot of produce a lot of the people that visit our website, but also overseas we have now pretty much from every continent visitors to that access those tools, from strategy development again to finance to kind of templates and examples on how to deal with the crisis. So with that, I want to hand off the presentation to our team. You already heard about Aabid, Mia, and Travis. So why don't we get started? Aabid, it's all yours.
Jose, thank you so much. Super excited to be with you today, and excited to get to present a little bit about some of the work that we've done, and maybe offer some insights into how to move forward through this difficult time. So to start off, just going to walk through the agenda. We're going to be walking through today a scenario planner that will basically encapsulate how to help make decisions in light of the current situation. Then we'll be jumping into a little bit about financial modeling and how to use quantitative decision making to help inform our scenario planner. And finally, we'll be launching into some Q&A just to help with any outstanding concerns that you may have. So first, we're going to jump into the scenario planner, and to help us understand the scenario planner today, we're going to be using the example of a company called the Imani Collective. And so I'm going to offer a little bit of background on the Imani Collective to help us frame the scenario planner as we walk through today's presentation. The Imani Collective is a nonprofit that is based in Dallas, but has the majority of their operations in Kenya. They were actually started by a graduate of the Bush School and a woman who came up through the AdventGX program under Jose. The revenue comes from 2 sources. First, from selling handmade decorations, and secondly, from donations. The goal for them was to become self-sustaining by 2021. However, in light of COVID, they were unable to do so and had to pivot towards donations again as a primary source of income. The Amani Collective empowers unique change in Kenya by employing women and minorities and allowing them to develop tangible skills while essentially working to educate the people of the area. And so this has had significant impacts in the area, and they do this by making and selling handmade house goods that then is sold in the United States and generates revenue for the community there. Restrictions in both the US and Kenya have severely impacted their ability to produce. And so we're going to be walking through a scenario planner and then actually applying that scenario planner to the Amani Collective today to help you understand or to help with understanding through the example. So I'm going to go ahead and send in the chat a link, textag /planner. And if you want to go to this link, you'll actually see a scenario planner on a PDF just to help you follow along as we walk through this today. That scenario planner is comprised of 4 main parts. First, we're going to look at the key drivers, or the things that actually impact the mission of our organization. These things are going to be quantifiable, and we're going to actually be able to measure these things as we walk through the rest of our analysis. Then we're going to develop model scenarios, or look at what's happening in the world and try to understand how that might affect our business. Then we're going to create a portfolio of actions, understanding what different actions we can enact based on the current situation. And finally, we're going to look at our key trigger points, or where we actually should enact each of our actions, depending on how certain aspects of the nonprofit are impacted. So now I'm going to turn it over to Aabid to talk about key drivers and risk factors.
Thanks so much, Travis. So it's absolutely no secret that things are changing dramatically as a result of COVID in the nonprofit sector specifically. And so we've seen either an increase in the demand for different programs and services that are provided, or a steep reduction in the ability of nonprofits to actually provide the programs that they once would. But regardless of what situation that your nonprofit may be in, scenario planning is an effective way of moving into the future with a proper plan so that you can be proactive rather than reactive. And so the first step in the scenario planning process, as Travis pointed out, is going to be to identify the key drivers at risk within your organization. So all a key driver really is something that drives your organization's economics or the impact of your organization. So think of these as things that keep the lights on, motivate people to come into work each and every day, and allow you to fulfill your mission as an organization. And so to better understand these drivers and analyze them as we move forward, we're going to be splitting them up by importance and the risk of their disruption. So the basic 3 categories of any nonprofit fall into the programs, operations, and funding. And so for identifying your key drivers, it's going to be no different at all. So once you see your key drivers, you're going to go thoroughly through each of your programs, operations, and funding activities in order to see what are the activities that truly drive the impact forward that your organization is able to make. It's important to be as thorough as you possibly can in this process. And just because something may not be your flagship program or even your largest source of funding, it doesn't mean that it should be left off in the process of writing down your key drivers. In this process, you want to be on the side of writing down more than you need to than having things left out for the future. So in order to evaluate each of these key drivers, once we've written them down, we're going to do it based on their importance to the organization and then their risk. So as we look towards how important something is for our organization, people tend to overestimate how important things truly are. But at a time like COVID, it's important to realize what are things that are fundamental to your mission as an organization, and what are things that help propel the growth of your organization. And so at a time like this, you want to prioritize things that are fundamental to the mission rather than things that help expand in the future. Now, as we reach a point of financial sustainability farther down the line, then that's where we can start to focus on things such as growth for the organization. But now as we look into how to analyze the risk that each of these drivers poses to our organization, we're first going to look at the nature of the risk. Meaning, what does it mean? Which part of the organization is this risk associated with? Next, we're going to look at the likelihood that the risk comes to fruition. And finally, if this risk does come to fruition, what is the impact that that's going to make on the organization? Now, as we take a look here at the blank scenario planner, it's going to provide us a great tool in order to visualize the information that we're now creating. So on the left-hand side, you can see that it's once again split up into the categories of programs, operations, and funding. And on the right-hand side, we can write down the level of importance and the level of risk to our organization. But in the middle is where we're actually going to write down the key drivers that are at risk. And an important note about using these key drivers is that we want to be able to track the changes over time within the organization. And so the best way to do that is to have drivers that are quantifiable in nature. If our drivers are too broad, then it's going to be incredibly difficult to see what exactly is going on within the organization. So some examples of what this may look like can be illustrated through the Amani Collective. So as we take a look at the number of artisans employed by the organization, now that is something that is incredibly quantifiable. We can track the number of artisans employed and see what's happening to that number over time. And as we also look towards the sourcing of materials for overall programming, that is also something that we can track the changes in the overall ability of the organization to source their materials. Now looking at how we determine the level of importance and the level of risk for some of these. So the sourcing of materials and overall programming is critical to the success of the Amani Collective. And the reason for that is because without the sourcing of materials, they won't be able to produce the goods that bring in the revenue for their organization. And the level of risk for this driver is incredibly high because they've already experienced disruptions within their supply chain. Now, as we look towards something like the number of artisans that are trained back in the program section, we realize that the level of importance is low. And at first glance, that may seem odd. But remember, training new artisans is going to be something that expands the mission of the organization and isn't something that's fundamental to it. And the reason why the level of risk is low for something like this is because virtual options have come about for the training, which make it a low risk of completely losing that as a whole. So as we wrap up the process of creating our key drivers, here are just a few notes that you would want to keep in mind to be sure that you can do the best job possible. So you want to be sure that you're as thorough in your analysis as possible, and that no matter how small a risk may seem, that you still place it on the list of key drivers. Because ultimately in the future, as things change, something that seems unimportant now may become increasingly important in the future, and vice versa. Next, you want to be sure that you collaborate with people at all levels of your organization. One of the largest pitfalls that happens is that executives try to create these scenario planners on their own, and they often don't coordinate with people at different stages of the organization to see what their day-to-day might look like. Especially when writing down a list of key drivers, understanding what goes on at each level of the organization is critical. And then you want to also be as specific as possible when creating your key drivers. Because once again, if you start to generalize too much, it becomes very difficult to pinpoint where changes are occurring within your organization. But the more specific you can be in tracking the changes that occur, then the more specific you can be in addressing those changes and the more tailored those changes can be. And a few things that we want to be sure that we avoid doing. So we want to be sure that we don't underestimate the risk levels that are posed by outside threats. So it's easy to see government intervention as an outside threat that simply doesn't affect our day-to-day. But especially at a time like this, a simple lockdown could have a devastating impact on the ability of an organization to move forward. And disruptions in supply chains are becoming increasingly common across the world as well. Also, we don't want to overestimate the importance of drivers. Once again, we need to prioritize for the organization because in the short term, during a crisis such as COVID, we have to prioritize things that are going to allow the organization to remain in business in the long term, rather than things that will help the organization grow in the short term. And finally, you don't want to list programs or operations themselves as your drivers. So an after-school program is a program in itself, but the driver for that would be something like the number of students attending the program, something that's far more measurable and allows us to adjust in the future. So now I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Mia so she can explain how to create some model scenarios.
Thank you, Aabid. Now that we've taken the time to develop some key drivers for your organization, we'll next consider how each of those might be impacted in a best, moderate, or worst case scenario. The goal of this step is planning, so we want to take some time to understand what the impact might be across a full spectrum of possibilities for your organization. With these key drivers, since we've quantified them, we'll focus on how they might impact your revenue streams in the future. Ultimately, we'll understand the financial impact of all of these possibilities for your organization. There are a few tips when starting to evaluate these model scenarios. The first is to choose a relevant time horizon for your organization. When we ran through this process for the Amani Collective, we elected to use 1 year, but depending on your budget cycle, a time period of 6 months or even a quarter may be more relevant. The second, like I mentioned before, is aiming for planning rather than precision. Here, we want to develop a robust understanding of what may happen given a variety of events, rather than precisely determining what financial steps are your next best move. The last tip is not to underestimate the worst case. It may be painful to consider this, but if you consider the worst case, it'll help you develop actions in the future that will continue your mission long term. Here's an example scenario planner. So the first step is to consider external factors that will directly impact your organization. This could be anything depending on your mission, from policy turbulence to changes in shelter-in-place restrictions. For each of these external factors, you'll consider what a best, moderate, and worst case scenario might be. If you can assign numbers or dates to these, that's great, but if not, that works well too. Then you'll transfer the prioritized key drivers you took in step 1. As Aabid mentioned, in step 1, you developed a list of all of your key drivers. If it's helpful in this list, you can narrow them down to the most important. For each of these drivers, in the categories of programs, operations, and funding, you'll consider a best, moderate, and worst case impact on your revenue streams. Ultimately, you'll look at the projected impact, summing up all of these scenarios on your revenue forecast. So we ran through this process for the Amani Collective. We determined that some external factors that would directly impact their operations in Dallas and Kenya were gathering restrictions in both countries, uncertainty of government policy, and even a potential outbreak of COVID. In projecting a best, moderate, and worst case scenario, we'll use the example of gathering restrictions. The best case would be a release of restrictions that occurs in about a week or so. A moderate case would be a release of restrictions in the spring. And the worst case, one that would seriously impact their organization's operations, would be almost a year from now, an October 30th release of restrictions. Next, we considered how each of these cases might impact their key drivers. We'll take the example of material sourcing. Given a best case scenario, with a quick release of restrictions, extensive government relief for nonprofits, and a reduced COVID caseload, Amani Collective would only see a slight cost increase in their raw materials. However, in a moderate case, they would see a 15 to 30% increase, and in the very worst case, they would see a major cost increase. When we ran through each of these scenarios for all of our key drivers, we were able to assess what the projected impact on the organization's revenue might be, given the full spectrum of possibilities. In the best case, they would see a 15 to 20% decrease. Moderate would be a 15 to 30% decrease. And the very worst case would be a 30 to 50% decrease. Now that Amani has this information, they're able to translate this into actionable insights for their organization. In the next step, Aabid will discuss how we worked with Amani to create an action portfolio.
Thanks, Mia. So in the first stage, we looked at the internal factors of the organization. And in the second stage, we looked at more external factors that would affect the organization. Now, in the third step, we're going to combine the two of them in order to create a portfolio of actions moving forward. Now, the point of this is to develop a set of actions that will allow us to manage against different scenarios that may arise in the future, so that you can once again be proactive and ahead of the curve instead of being reactive and more rushed in your decision-making process. So each of these actions is going to be split up into one of three categories: something that's appropriate for any scenario, something that's a smaller scale, more flexible change, and then larger, more permanent changes that can be made in your organization. So something that's an appropriate for any scenario action will be something that will improve your financial standing or the ability for you to implement your impact, no matter what the scenario becomes in the future. And an example of that would be, as a result of COVID, you may want to increase the amount of technological integration that you have within your nonprofit. And regardless of what happens in the future, technological integration would likely be a good idea for you moving forward. Now, a smaller scale, more flexible change is something that's reversible in nature and doesn't cost your organization a whole lot to implement or reverse. And so something like this would be maybe the reduction of the programs that you're offering by 2 a week, or simply a reduction in the salaries of your executives. And doing something like this for a short period of time will allow you to free up more cash within the organization, but not fundamentally change the way that your organization operates. Now, finally, you have the larger, more permanent types of actions. And these are going to be ones that are far more difficult to reverse should they not go the way that you plan. So you want to be sure that you're incredibly tailored when you make these types of actions and you've tested them on a smaller scale. So an example of this would be a change in your supply chain or the reduction of staff as a whole. So as we take a look forward in creating the portfolio of actions, there's a few tips and tricks that we want to truly impact, that we want to drive home for you to be able to create the best portfolio of actions. Now, as I stated before, you want to really refer back to the model scenario that you've created and then the quantification of the impacts in each of your drivers as you create this portfolio of actions. And so by doing so, what you're going to be able to do is to combine the factors that are external to your company and understand what the impact would be internally. And by doing so, you're going to be able to more effectively plan for the future and make sure that every possible scenario in the future is accounted for. So now as we look at the example of the scenario planner once again, I want to point out that although there are only 12 slots on this screen, that in your organization, there will likely be dozens more and maybe even dozens per category of these types of actions. This is simply an example to be used. So on the left-hand side, once again, it's split up into the categories of appropriate for any scenario, smaller and more flexible changes, and then the larger and more permanent changes as well. But on the far right-hand column, you'll see the estimated cost to your organization. And that's going to be incredibly important as you move forward when you start trying to weigh the impacts versus the costs of taking a certain action step. And so you can also change that to not be in terms of dollars, but being in terms as a percentage of your budget. And that can help you actually visualize what's going on within your budget and what different changes would be best for your organization. So now the example of the Amani Collective is a pretty straightforward one. So an appropriate action for any scenario would be to eliminate discretionary budget expenses. So as a result of COVID, they've not been traveling from the United States to Kenya, and they've been working from home. And as a result, they no longer have the overhead charges of travel and office supplies. And so regardless of what goes on in the future, the Amani Collective has decided that these are not things that are crucial to their organization's success. And as a result, they can reduce these types of costs. Now, something that's a smaller scale, more flexible change would be to reduce executive level salaries by 20% or 25% for just the current year. Now, this is something that would free up cash in the short term, but not really fundamentally change anything about the organization. And then in the next year, the salary would return to its normal level. Really no cost associated with doing that. But as we take a look at the larger, more permanent changes, now laying off staff has costs in both the short term and the long term. And those are things that an organization is simply going to have to weigh and understand that it's not something that you can simply reverse if you let someone go. And so once you've created this portfolio of
How are you?
then I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Travis so that he can go over the final step of the scenario planner.
Awesome, thank you. So moving into the final step of the scenario planner, we want to wrap everything up and put everything together to determine when we should actually implement our actions. So to do this, we want to answer a couple questions. First, at what point will we have to act? We want to base the answer to this question in something that is both measurable and on our balance sheet, so financially tied. We want to understand if if revenue or profit drops by a certain amount, then we have to act. And then the second question we want to answer is, how do these points connect to the model scenario and action portfolio? So going back to our original model scenarios, we walked through each scenario as it pertained to our overall business. We want to understand these scenarios as they relate to our actions that Aabid just spoke about. So for example, when we look at our scenario planner here, we see the actions on the left, scenarios in the middle, and key trigger points on the right. An action would be something that we pull in from our portfolio of actions. A scenario would be understanding what environmental factors would lead to implementation of that action. And then finally, a key trigger point would look like a specific measurable item tied to our revenue or profit that informs us when we need to act. So in order to make this a little bit more clear, we're going to jump into a quick example from the Amani Collective again. Again, we see all of our actions from our portfolio of actions on the left. So we're going to jump into our first example here, the elimination of discretionary budget expenses. Again, this is something that we wanted to enact regardless of the situation. We realize that we're in a COVID situation here, and that's not going to change anytime soon, and we need to act quickly in order to stay alive as a nonprofit. And to do that, we are going to complete this action regardless of the situation. For your business, this might look different, but we usually develop a string of actions that we should complete immediately, regardless of the scenario. Next, we see the reduction of executive level salaries by 25%. Again, if we're functioning at our greatest capability, this is something that is unnecessary. However, the current time has called for significant changes to how we do business. And because of that, in a moderate case scenario, we've written a statement that if revenue falls by 10%, we will reduce executive level salaries by 25%. In doing this, we actually write each of our trigger points as an if-then statement. If X happens, then we will enact Y. And we need to clearly communicate with the individuals responsible for enacting each of these changes. For example, in the reduction of executive level salaries, we want to communicate up front with our executive team that this will occur if revenue falls by 10%. That way, when revenue falls by 10%, they're not taken by surprise by the following action. Finally, we see our last and most drastic action. If revenue falls by 40%, in the worst case scenario, we will lay off non-essential staff. For many nonprofits, the business is the people. And the most important element of being in a nonprofit is the people that they get to interact with on a daily basis. However, it is during this time, survival is more important. And because of that, often when we look at these businesses, it is necessary for both the business's survival and the individual's growth to part ways. And so if revenue falls by 40% or more, the Amani Collective will lay off non-essential staff. This is the most difficult of our scenarios, but it is also one of the most necessary in order for the business to survive. Finally, we want to wrap everything up today. And to do this, we want to walk through each of the pieces of our scenario planner one last time. First, we identify key drivers. Then we walk through our model scenarios, develop a portfolio of actions, and finally look at our trigger points to know when we need to enact each of those actions. Remember, the Amani Collective and our examples as we walk through this process are generalized, and every nonprofit should look at their own individual needs and analyze any propositions for change. Your business may be thriving through the COVID pandemic. It may be needed now more than ever. And as a result, this may not be a step that is as drastic or as difficult for you to walk through. However, there are businesses on the brink of disaster right now, and we understand that and hope that this serves as a tool that helps. I'm now going to turn it over to Jose to walk through the financial model.
Thank you very much, Travis. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it now. Perfect. Before we go through the model, I wanted to share with you a couple of items in regards to Amani Collective. Interesting facts is actually Jenny, the founder. It's a graduate from the Bush School, so that's pretty cool. She got a master's degree from your programs. So that's a testament of the quality of the people that you are producing. It's really, she's a driven young lady, and she had a big dream, and she's been through a lot of learning experiences. A lot of them are hard, very hard learning experiences, but she's been able to manage that over participating in 2 different continents. So she is definitely one of our poster nonprofits that we have helped in the past. I also wanted to let you know that if you want access to this very simple tool, you will be able to do that. We will publish the link to the resource page where you can have access to this, along with other items that we have put together for your to support your operations. Okay, so this is the what we call the input section of the model. Very simple. And what we recommend is that as a nonprofit, you take this particular version and obviously make it your own, but keep track of your versions. You're gonna want to have kind of an initial version. Let's call it 1.0, which is the standard situation of your nonprofit. And then as you go through the process, start generating versions for the different scenarios that you're going to be matching or working on, depending on your master plan. So in this particular case, we are listing items. The inputs are actually derived from the financial statements from the Imani collective financial set of parameters. So just to go through the process, just so you know, you have a little bit more reference on what each item means. In some of the cases, you can hover over the items that have a little red tab, and that will give you a little bit more information on it. And as we go through more scenarios, we're going to be adding more kind of online help to this tool. In this particular case, the first item, cash in bank, I wanted to make to be very specific. That is cash or funds that you have access to, but that do not have any donor restrictions associated with them. And just for planning purposes, in this case, let's assume that you have a set of funds that come in that are very, very specifically appropriated for, let's say, education, or participating in specific seminars, travel expenses, and so on. You do not want to include that on the on this model. You want to be able to have a listing of all the assets that you have, kind of liquid assets that you can have at your disposal in a short notice. So we have the cash on bank account. We have a line of credit if you have one. Any assets that you can dispose of that you can convert into cash rapidly. Obviously, that's a scenario where you have to probably get 50 cents on the dollar or less, but you should go through that inventory process. Other funds that you may have available, cash on hand, so on and so forth. And then if you received any emergency funding from the government, that will be where you add that. So the addition of all those items will give you a good sense of what you have in cash reserves. Next, we have your 12-month revenue baseline. So that's based on the previous year. That's how much this particular nonprofit generated in revenue. And again, in this case, it's interesting that they do have kind of a retail operation, and they also have all the revenue they receive from donations. And that's going to be relevant here a little bit later. As we go into expected revenue under disaster, that kind of what would you think will be the projected revenue every month? So instead of being a full year, we want to be specific to each month. And then we have a worst case scenario. So that gives you kind of a delta, and that will give us a way to have a range of possible outcomes under our timeline. Then under our under our outflows, in this particular case, if we talk about the cost of goods sold, well, those are the items that are sold here in the US. In their particular situation, even though the products are manufactured overseas, those products are actually now kind of Americanized, if you will. So even the designs, the packaging, and so on is made to match the markets here in the US. So that has been a great difference in appealing factor and also sales. eventually resulting in much better revenue. Is how they were able to develop products, not so much products that are African per se, but that have that American flair. And if you ever get a chance and go to their website, you'll see that those products are beautiful and are very much about the American culture, but in a way that still represents its origin. The fact that they use organic products to produce these items, and just a very a very purchase the kind of emotion that they evoke on the consumer base. They do a very good job doing that, so they sell well. So I wanted to underline that in this particular case, the cost of goods sold is a percentage of the whole revenue coming in. So they actually have higher cost of goods sold percentage when you look at the items that they sell. But since only 50% of the revenue comes from the sales of items, that kind of tells you that the actual COGS or cost of goods sold percentage is probably more like 50%. But again, in this model, we're using it just to simplify things as a percentage of the whole revenue that they receive every year. If at the end of the presentation or next week, any of your entities or nonprofits need support with that, we will be happy to modify that to be more compatible with your particular situation. If you do not have an item, if you don't have items that sell as part of your mission, you can just put a 0 there, and that will take care of the problem. The fully burdened salaries, we have also a monthly load. We have rent. In this particular case, they already have factored in forbearance or discount that they will be able to take advantage of. So even though their commitment is $3,000 a month, overall, rents combined, they right now are receiving that benefit through the crisis. So they are deducting $2,000 a month from that. As far as the existing loans, that's their loan that they have. Disaster relief loan interest rate, that is usually 1.3 to 3.5%. In this case, just to be prudent, we're using 4%. And then other items that they have on a monthly basis, commission of sales that they have in relation to their products that they have online. Utilities, contracted services, insurance. It's just important to list all those items there. And we try to kind of bundle that on their miscellaneous expenses just in case, so we can have an accurate picture. So based on those inputs, you can see the horizon that generates. So in this particular case, you know that if they are able to match the projected revenue without making many modifications or sacrifices to salaries and so on, they will be able to survive for 4 straight months. If they are under the worst case scenario, that gets reduced to 3 months. So that kind of gives you a picture. Green is good, red is not that good. So what I'm going to play with a little bit just to illustrate the process, if they decide to cut salaries or reduce their labor expenses by 66%, they will be able to make it through the crisis without any problems, right? So that's kind of a drastic cut that they can consider implementing. But then we can also go and say, well, what happens if we do a third? We do a combination of reduction of pay that can be extended through the crisis, and that will tell us that if we are able to target, we have enough breathing room. We have 7 months to plan the kind of pivoting of the nonprofit, how to go after additional funding. Usually, when you have those many months ahead of schedule on your horizon, if you will, you're able then to be a little bit more strategic on how you generate additional funds, do special fundraising events, or partner with other entities to generate more revenue. So once you go through this exercise, then and you click on the next tab, and that has a template that you can use to modify using the inputs that you provided. But here, then you can make it your own. You can go ahead and expand upon that model, so that you can have the flexibility of the financial forecasting side of the equation. So here you can also see the horizon that you will receive of sustainability, financial sustainability for the expected revenue level and for the worst case scenario. Also, you will have access to some of the data visualization tools that you can modify as well. Just wanted to illustrate here on the earnings, obviously, because we're in a crisis. You're in a negative cash flow every month. The numbers look kind of they look a little bit. Let me see if I can show that. We have a way to project into the future years. We provided 7 years, a 7-year horizon, so you can start making modifications to the future revenue expectations and as well as expenses, and be able to see, you do want to recover fast. So hopefully in this case, we don't reach full sustainability until probably by year 10. So you don't want that scenario. You want to be able to make the necessary changes to proactively recover within 3 to 4 years. So with that, I want to pass the presentation back to Mia so that we can show you or share with you where we have the resources. Let me see, I think I need to stop my share. So Mia, if you can load your presentation, that would be great.
Thanks, Jose. Before we dive into the question and answer portion of this presentation, I'd just like to take a minute to thank the OneonOne Collective for providing us with their data and Bridgespan for originating the scenario planner we shared with you today. I know that the presentation ends at 1, so we may not have time to get all of the questions answered. We'd like to encourage you to connect with us. You can see here our website, which has a link to the scenario planner, as well as a variety of other resources that we've curated for nonprofit leadership. Please also feel free to reach out to our student team and Jose by email if you have any questions that we aren't able to get to today or that come up as you're working through this process. At this point, we're free to answer any questions you may have, so please go off mute if you have a question or send it in the chat.
That's excellent. Thank you, everybody. I'm sure that we've got, give them a minute.
Yeah, and while that's taking place, I wanted to share with you that if you need a one-on-one consultancy, that's something that our team provides at no charge. Just go to that website and go through the scheduling link. And one of our team members will get with you. We'll collect some data from you to make sure we assign you to the right team. And we'll be happy to help. Obviously, right now, those consultancies are via Zoom or by phone. But hopefully, in the not too distant future, we'll be able to meet in person as well. And thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for the opportunity again. It's great.
Oh, you bet. I mean, one thing that I was curious about, I'll put out there, was sort of a reaction between excellent tool, great detail, but to what degree do you feel like organizations run into over-analysis versus action? I know that there tends to be a propensity of nonprofits to act, right? You guys gave us a nice list of potential actions, and so people start doing stuff. So how do you think about the balance between analysis and action and those kinds of things for an organization?
Yeah, that, if you don't mind, I'll address that question. That's a very good point that we noticed. Most of the companies that contacted us at the very beginning of the crisis, they were really, under an urgent. The sense of urgency was very evident. It was very hard to be able to overanalyze it. They just didn't have enough time for that. So in those particular cases at the beginning, it was more about getting ahead of the of the management of their financial resources. They felt that they were just bleeding money, funding, and then have absolutely no revenue coming in. So in those cases, just because of the nature of the situation, it was a fairly fast, not as strategic, if you will. The analysis wasn't as profound, but I believe that the actions were actually pretty much on spot. And it really helped, well, in a particular case, it helped that we had kind of representatives in our advisory council from almost every single industry. So we could always, reach out to specific industry experts, if you will, or subject matter experts. And the process was a little bit more interactive because there were some there was some analysis that dealt more with market possibilities, and those market access to markets were changing so fast that it really required more of making phone calls versus basing the research on published information. And then moving forward, one of the communities in South Texas that contacted us, for them, they had in place already a mechanism to dispense funds to their for-profit and non-profit entities in their community, but they were concerned because a lot of the very early entities that received funding, they didn't really do a good job with their money. So in their second phase, they asked their recipients to schedule a consultancy with us so that we could provide them with a little bit of documentation and just an analysis. So it always helps. I think that's one of the pluses of going through this process is really helps to have an outside entity look at your process, at your strategy, at your planning documentation. Because by now we work with several different type of industries, so you get to have a little bit more of a broad picture. And when you're working on a vacuum, it gets pretty scary, especially doing.
Yeah, I would think getting some help or getting some perspective. And Deborah asked the question about size. Have you had how you see differences between small, medium, and large organizations and their capacity to take up the tool?
Yeah, most of the entities that will contact us are fairly small. Are actually all of them are considered small business entities, and within the nonprofit side, they've always been also fairly small. But as you know, the Small Business Administration definition of a small business, you're talking about $200 million a year in revenue, or really, those are actually very big companies within the context of our local community. But on the nonprofit side, one of the ones that needed the most help was it's a youth development program based out of downtown Bryan. Their level of access, or their access to financial tools and to just research and planning is very limited. So I would say that will probably be the smallest. And I think Travis helped. It's a gym. It's a boxing club for kids that are in financial need, and are looking for outlays to grow personally. And that was a challenge because again, lack of proper financial documentation and things like that. On the larger side, most of those entities that we have helped are more like associated with franchises, but they themselves, the actual franchisees, are fairly standard size. You're talking about revenues of $1 to $3 million a year.
Yeah, Jose, I can also take maybe the side of that question that's a little bit about more of the scenario planner and how it relates to different size companies. I would just say, Deborah, great question. I think the differences in how it relates to companies, I think you can use the scenario planner across basically every size company or nonprofit. However, I do think that depending on the size of the company, it will really differ in the scale of how the scenario planner is laid out. So you have a lot more stakeholders involved. You're talking about a lot higher revenue. You're also going to be talking about a lot more people and potentially more drastic decisions coming out of the scenario planning process. And I would also factor in the fact that it will take longer. It will be a longer process because there's just so much more moving pieces. But I still think the actual pieces of this analysis work in moving towards a strategic plan to go forward. So hope that helps.
Yeah, that's good. Other questions?
Yeah, I guess I'll throw one out there to you guys for anyone to respond to. This gets to, organizations, business metrics, seen it quite a bit, or at least some form of it in the nonprofit industry. Does any of your work kind of naturally get into, a shift of visions at organizations? Are you doing any of that with them on the consultant side after you go through a process with business metrics, and then it just floats over to how they think about their actual vision and whatever community they operate out of?
Yes, one of the examples that I can share with you, one of the local entities here actually in College Station, South College Station, they provide transportation services to the Houston airport.
Mhm.
And all that really got stopped. So we helped them pivot into more of a logistics company. So being able to transport goods instead of just people to the airport. Number one. Number two, help them also pivot or adapt into working with very kind of high-end COVID compliant transportation of VIPs or individuals at the beginning of the crisis that had to be moved from place to place. They were able to adapt their vans to have a very high level of sanitation processes in place, and also encapsulating the different, kind of dividing the different rows of their vans so that individuals could be transported without being exposed to each other's probability of having COVID. So yeah, to your point, we actually a lot of within the process that we have, a lot of those processes deal with more of the strategy of the business versus just their financial adaptability.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering off of Will's question of, you go through a process like that, they put it into action, or do they at all? But I imagine many executives that are passionate about a mission-based organization would have some, tough decisions to make, or it'd be tough to wrap their mind around what might seem like such an extreme shift.
You are correct. That is a very hard situation, especially on a nonprofit, right? It's harder to pivot on those type of concepts.
Yeah, it's good that you have that conversation with them. So that's helpful. Yeah, appreciate that.
I think we have another question. Do you consult on non-financial aspects of the business? Yes, we do. We try to kind of concentrate more on the COVID side of the equation, but we have had to look at some of the sales side and a little bit of marketing under the new COVID guidelines and so on. So that will be kind of the extent of the support. Then a question from Angela. Thank you very much. All right. Okay. And I think we're pretty close to.
Yeah, I think we did it. A lot of good stuff. People got your contact information. They can follow up that way. Of course, reach out to us as well. We can connect you. Excellent team, everybody. I really appreciate your time. What a great model. The resource is excellent as well. And so appreciate you taking the time to be able to be here with us today.